My name is Angelina Avedano, and this is Interspace, where we explore the spaces between us. Join me for discussions on a series of realities with thinkers, writers, thought leaders, and artists. Robin Peery is professor of modern languages and film studies at Massasoit Community College. He's an active yogi, seeker, lightworker, cat dad, and husband. He sometimes writes stuff too. I hope you'll enjoy this great conversation with my friend and colleague, Robin Peery. Hey, Robin, it's summertime. We are on break, and welcome to Interspace Podcast today.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's good to see you live, Mama.
Oh, it's good to see you too. You're looking fabulous, all sun-kissed and gorgeous as always.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I would have brushed my hair for the occasion, but no one can see us. So.
Yeah, right? It's the day of the ponytail, right?
It's always the day of the ponytail.
Me too. Well, like I told you earlier, I just came from my massage, so you know what happens to your hair after that. So
it always has that kind of like sexy sex hair look. But
I think of it more as oily.
Wind tousled. Oh, this is my favorite thing about summertime is I love to go to the beach and jump in the water. Obviously, it's Atlantic water, so it's always freezing.
Yes.
But still, your hair always looks great after the beach. At least my hair always does. So I assume that's the case for everybody else. I did make the mistake earlier this summer of leaving it in like a bun.
Oh.
That was a hot mess.
Okay.
But now I've learned, go to the beach, you have amazing hair for 2 days.
Are you sure that you just don't feel great, so you think your hair looks better than it does?
Don't
ruin it for you.
Don't ruin my fantasy here. In my mind, I'm Bo Derek in 10. I don't have the cornrows, obviously, right? But right. My hair is bouncing. It looks amazing.
Oh, well, I'm sure it's true.
And I hope your listeners understand and appreciate a Bo Derek reference from 1981.
Yeah, you're kind of dating yourself a little bit there,
well,
and me, because I know that
born
movie.
that year.
Yeah. Right. Yes, of course. Oh, I wanted to have a conversation. There's a couple of things going on, but first of all, we have a couple of things in common. And one is that you are recently venturing, as I am this year, into the realm of radio show and podcast.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. You just recently started your radio show. Can you talk to me about it?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So, and thanks for asking about it. The show is called Loud and Proud, which took a lot longer to think of than it should have. And when you and I have discussed this, when you're stuck at home and there's a pandemic and you're trying to do something creative or find something that might benefit other folks, I teach in the Department of Comm Arts. I teach film classes, but I'm also in cahoots with the radio folks. I got set up with a really great student producer at the college. So what I did is I started a podcast, a radio show. Mm-hmm. That airs on Radio Massasoit, and I am in discussion with some folks to get it airing on other radio stations, live radio stations, physical radio stations, as opposed to just internet radio. Not that there is anything wrong with internet radio. And that is, it's a show that for 1 hour I'm playing music from artists who are part of the LGBT plus community. So folks that either in their life were actively gay or were closeted, and we've learned as time goes on, or folks who have always been champions for the LGBTQ community, and that I have no limits on genre. I think that might be a deterrent for some people. So you could at any episode hear Billie Holiday, Madonna, some gay bro country. some
Yeah, as a matter of
rap.
fact, I've been
Yeah.
listening to your show, and what I love is that I get some great throwbacks, and then I get some international exposure that I have not heard before. So I kind of love going all over the place with your taste. I think it's great.
Thank you. It's fun to do. It's fun to research, and I also, I find a lot of artists that I've never heard of before, specifically Italian or South African or Korean artists that I don't know, and so I get the exposure as well. I try not to make it too academic in nature. Just a little bit of information. I have over time really understood more and more and more how impactful and important it is to have representation across the board for folks. So, I know what it was like to be a gay kid in the middle of nowhere, Midwest in the late 80s, early 90s. And yes, we can talk circles, academic circles and intellectually about the positive and negative impacts of Madonna's cultural appropriation of Vogue. But nevertheless, Vogue still was impactful. And it was certainly impactful on me, who was learning how to Vogue in my bedroom at age 8. So, so for folks to then learn more about that, I just, and maybe for my friends who I will always consider allies, that are listening, for them to maybe realize like, oh, I did not realize that this massively important jazz artist was actively bisexual, or that Billie Holiday was bisexual, things like this. So yeah, it's fun. I enjoy doing it, and we'll continue on the line we're recording this in August. I'm a little bit on hiatus, but we'll get back to it in September, as we will many other things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think I shared with you, listening to it the first time, the memory of getting out on my own for the first time, having my first apartment, right? Graduating high school, getting out on my own. It was probably the following year. Of course, I ran off with my boyfriend the day after graduation. And one of the first things I did before I had furniture, because all we had was 2 folding chairs, beach chairs that we got at at the grocery store or something. And before I did anything, I signed up for the Columbia House, get 10 albums for a penny. Right? And all the songs you were playing were those first albums that, that were like my prized possessions, right? Madonna, Cyndi Lauper, The Pretenders. I just remember it so well from, the 80s. So we're talking 1984, 85.
Did you get these on tape, cassette?
Oh, heck no. No. These were vinyl.
Album?
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Because I also fell into that trap many times in adolescence and early adulthood, I'm ashamed to say. Columbia House, BMG, where you get your 10 introductory for a penny. I think I always was a CD at that point, but I remember my brother had done it as well.
Yeah, that's because I'm so much older than you.
Not that much older than me.
Yes,
it's interesting how technology changes, right?
Yeah.
Because it went record, cassette, CD. Now everybody's collecting vinyl again. And as a matter of fact, I went somewhere and they had tapes. With hipsters, you never know if it's ironic or not. But people are listening to tapes again.
Yeah. And then before that was somewhere in there was the 8-track.
The 8-track.
Yes,
yeah.
The 8-track. The big
we
clunky click.
We had an 8-track player in I think it was a Pontiac that I grew up with, and I always wanted to listen to the Muppets Take Manhattan 8-track.
Oh,
that's the only 8-track I remember. There were others, of course, but I can't quite put names with them.
Yeah, that brings back so many memories about flipping the little flip open ashtray and the armrest in the back seat up and down and up and down. Do you remember that?
Yeah, and they would burn your arm in the summertime because they would get to 250 degrees in that hot, Midwestern sun with no shade. And then, or you couldn't even put your seatbelt on because it was so damn hot.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember this.
Yes.
I remember all of this.
Yes. So yeah, we both came up from this this kind of space in the Midwest where you were kind of insinuating that this was a time when you were really looking to identify yourself, to find an identity for yourself in this place, which is so, so contained, and it's so myopic in its view of the world because you don't know anything else. I mean, you grew up there. It was wonderful. There was lots of wonderful space and crickets and, cicadas in the trees and all that great stuff. But it really didn't allow for a world view that was expansive.
I have come to understand over time, that's pretty universal, right? Like, regardless of where you grow up, if you are not exposed to a lot of things, you are going to have that very one-sided, myopic perspective. And, it has to be your family or your teachers at that young age who are really bringing you out. And, of course, we're talking pre-internet. Now, for better or for worse, that's all changed. But I still think if you look at the narrative and the hero's journey or the individual journey, and you've got to start somewhere. We just watched that Green Knight film with Sir Gawain over the weekend. It was beautiful to look at, but I was a little bored, to be honest. But that was even something I remember a Green Knight film from my childhood with Sean Connery in it. It's from the 80s. And I was telling my husband and a friend of ours, like, we rented this movie at the video store / bait shop because
yes,
because that really kind of encapsulates that small town existence. But that's everywhere. We were just in northern Maine, up in Bar Harbor, and you still see that kind of like bait shop / ice cream parlor.
There was something wonderful about that time too, because there was a lot of freedom. We left the house, we rode our bikes, we just sort of took off and explored nature and the world in that way, in that, small context. I remember without a lot of supervision, just go out and figure it out.
I recently had that conversation with my mother where I was kind of lecturing her about, you need to get on your bicycle and go to these spots. And she was like, where do you ride a bicycle around here? And I was like, well, when I was 15, now, like, not when I was your age, obviously, because she's old, but I was like, well, I was 15, we rode out here and here. And she was like, if I had known that you were out riding bicycles on these highways, I would have never let you do it. And I was like, well, that's why I never told you.
That's it. There was all kinds of things that happened in those spaces, and not all of them were good, right? Because we can talk about how fun that was, but kids are cruel, and it was hard to find your way and figure out who you were, and there was so much peer pressure and so much boredom and just angst, right?
Well, yeah, I feel like that's a universal truth for most adolescents. Mm-hmm. Regardless of where you are, regardless of where you come from, you're mostly looking to get away from it.
Isn't that if you can. Well, the other thing that we have in common is that, over the past 2 years, I guess it is it? I think it's 2 years now that we've been working on mindfulness at the college where we're at, just trying to provide some mindfulness spaces and conversations. But I wanted to talk about that a little bit today because I'm starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable with that word, mindfulness, because it's just becoming, like everything else, it just sort of becomes this catch-all cliche. And I wondered how you felt about that. How do you feel about this? It's like there's like a mindfulness movement, and I don't really like getting lumped in with that, but it is a really important part of my life and my daily practice to keep myself, as we were talking yesterday, sane and centered. Like, how are we going to stay sane and centered? And mindfulness is a huge part of my practice, but I'm starting to feel a little uncomfortable with the term.
Could I ask if you're uncomfortable with the term because of all of the other people who are co-opting it and making it kind of generic?
Yeah, I feel like it has become generic, and yet when you say it, people do have a certain kind of, I don't know, they just kind of put you in a sort of category.
Why do you care what other people think?
I don't really care what people think, but I don't really like the category.
Well, who likes the category? Well, you and I have had some experience with some people misunderstanding what it is that we do. Those folks are using references that in my mind are very basic. And I mean basic in the Gen Z basic AF kind of terminology.
Wait, you gotta back up and unpack all of that for me. I do know what Gen Z is, but go back.
Basic AF, basic as fuck. Can I say fuck on this?
I don't know. I guess you can.
I guess I did. Well, so, it's very easy right now to type in, you can type in mindfulness on your computer in a Google search, and you will be led to any number of blogs or pay sites or applications that you can download to your phone. And all of those are monetary for the most part, right? Like you are paying a subscription to get some sort of service, and that service is calming you down. So I look at a lot of those things as being capitalist ventures, things where people have taken ideas that are not specifically inherent to one tradition. I think another thing is when folks think mindfulness, they think, who are these Westerners co-opting Buddhist ideologies and practices? But I've been reading a lot of Kabbalistic literature and just books on not Madonna Kabbalah, but because that is itself another kind of thing. But just reading some things that have been recommended to me over the past years. And, you can see behind me, I have a myriad of books and I've only read like half of them. Mm-hmm. So I got a lot of work to do. But as I read texts on not just Buddhist or quote unquote Eastern traditions and insights, because aren't all religions Eastern, mm-hmm. Dealing with and overcoming or working with PTSD.
Yeah.
And how useful mindfulness practices are for mental health professionals, therapists, folks working with groups, folks who are working individually with people with trauma. And if you are listening to this wonderful podcast right now, you are somebody who is aware that we are in the midst of an overwhelming universal trauma, that a lot of folks are throwing that word around, but they have no insight into what it means or what the effects can be. And that lots of folks are experiencing a trauma right now. So many folks have experienced multitudes of trauma. They're just not aware of it. They don't have the language for it. They don't understand why they are acting the way that they do.
Yeah.
And God forbid that, I'm getting a bit on a soapbox here. What word do we need to use? What word will be better than the word that we currently have? Mm-hmm. That's just saying, look, you have the opportunity to take yourself out of this. Sometimes it really, to me, is some autoflagellation that I see a lot of people do, where when they get really worked up about something, they will revisit the trauma, and talk about it again and again and again and again. And yeah, I recently was reading The Body Keeps the Score. I was a little late to it. But I saw
it's on my summer reading list.
I see so many things in here where there's a discussion of the combat veterans and how when they are talking about in their support groups their individual trauma, but the combat trauma and reliving it, and this gets everyone else really excited about it. They're very excitable, these folks, but they're just really excited with the adrenaline of reliving the experience to the point where then, you weigh yourself out. So how are you going to go about getting that next level? Your adrenaline is exhausted. How are you going to get that dopamine fix? How are you going to, and this obviously leads to addiction. This leads to so many of the things that are commonplace in our society that we have the language to address, but don't have the insight into. Mm-hmm. And what was your question again?
Well, we were talking about, you said you were going to get on your soapbox, and I think that's, where you went. But what we're talking about is just the kind of broad brushstrokes that mindfulness, is being painted with, and that there's so much more. There's so many more layers, and you were using it as a technique to whatever techniques that we have and we can apply to trauma and our layers of trauma. Does it matter what we're using and what we call it? For God's sake, we just need something to help.
Well, and even in such polemicized times where folks want to politicize words, you could call it prayer. If chanting or having a mantra or just simply praying, which I think might be a lot more accessible to folks who are, and maybe coming from a different tradition or are not as open to traditions outside of their own. But I think that also implies some cultural baggage and maybe some xenophobia. Mm-hmm. I don't want you to use the word mindfulness because you're Westerners. Well, what's so terrible about us using the word mindfulness? Mm-hmm. What's so terrible about us exploring something that maybe we didn't come up with?
Well, there's a really interesting conversation there, Robin, because, we get so invested in separating everything out into these nice little categories and boxes, and then we are stuck there in that box with only those tools. And here we have the entire world and all these cultures that could actually perhaps help us integrate some of these things that we're struggling with, and yet some will look at you and say you are appropriating that culture for your own benefit. And as someone who is, one, a world traveler, and two, teaches modern languages, and, three, who's just pretty culturally savvy, I'm just asking you to kind of expand on that a little bit.
So I will go back to your idea of the boxes. The boxes are helpful tools for a lot of folks to be able to categorize themselves. But as you said, you get stuck in the box. And I think, what if we use those boxes as building blocks? So yes, you can check off your box that you need to, but then get the hell out of that box. Because it might be a helpful reference point for you. But when you start to use that box as this is the end all be all of my existence, this is going to guide the way in which I live my life, well, then you're really doing yourself a huge disservice. You and I both know, and again, savvy folks who are listening to this podcast will probably be in the know as well, that we are in moments of tremendous upheaval culturally and socially. Having been, as you stated, a person who has traveled a lot and lived in other places and lived in other languages that are not my maternal language, but being forced to have to communicate in those languages and study them and make a lot of mistakes and have cultural humility, knowing here I am in a country where I can barely get around, or I can buy things and I can find the bathroom and not die. But in just kind of observing and being able to take observations and the mistakes that I make, whether those are, cultural misunderstandings or language failures. I have a tremendous amount of examples of totally messing up in other languages, and they're hilarious. But
can you share one?
Well, they're all like. So sure. So again, and this will be a theme that we'll visit, I'm sure. I tend to do things a little unconventionally, I suppose. My therapist says if you have the easy way and the hard way, you're always going to choose the hard way. It's just ingrained. I no longer judge that. I just kind of appreciate it at this point. But when I did my first study abroad, in French, a lot of folks would always go to France, and I was like, you know what? I want to go to Montreal. because I had more friends in Montreal, and I guess it was just something weird and different. And I also, I have I have a very soft spot for Canada. Some friends have called me a maple queen, and I wear that with pride. But I had a group of friends that were francophones. Then there were a lot of French people actually that I ran around with, and we were talking about a horoscope. And in French, the word vierge is virgin, Virgo. So you would say. So I was saying je suis. I meant to say je suis vierge. I said je suis vierge. I dropped the I, and I said I'm a dick.
Not a Virgo.
Not a Virgo, but a dick. So, there, you can do a lot with that, can't you? So knowing that, having those kind of accidents, and then also just having to just sit and listen. I have found, and knowing that maybe I don't have the language for something. I think that has been something that I've really taken to heart. Knowing that there are a myriad of experiences that are not my own, that I do not need to comment on, that I can just listen and be supportive of, or kind of internally wrestle with, or challenge, or decide, there are things that I need to learn more about here. I used to think that I needed to, again, that box. I was very much intent on being a good student and checking those boxes and getting those really good grades. And then, when you move from grad student to professor, I don't know how it was for you. For me, it was really hard to negotiate, like, oh shit, like I'm no longer just the student. But I also pride myself on continuously learning. Mm-hmm. And so I can be a lifelong scholar and a lifelong learner, but I don't have to be making the grade, so to speak. I can always just be learning and adding information, not so that I know more information, but so that I am aware, so that I can understand things to the best of my ability. I think there are so many things that folks are, and I also know that if something makes me uncomfortable, there's a reason. And I want to explore that deeper. Why does this make me so uncomfortable? Is it misconceptions that I may have on my own? I think we all have stereotypes. I think that we all have a lot of cultural ignorance, and there's nothing wrong by admitting that. How in the world can you know everything about everything? It's impossible.
And don't you think that's in part what feeds into a lot of the division and the strife that we're experiencing socially today, is just the discomfort with not knowing spaces that are unfamiliar to us, categories that are unfamiliar to us, and that threatens the worldview. That threatens your own, stable worldview.
Well, it's very much fear. It's all based in fear. Coming from a place, and also, it doesn't really matter where you live. You are always going to encounter someone who has either internalized a sense of homophobia or transphobia or racism, anti-Black racism, name it. You are going to find someone who has these things, and they don't know why. If you ask a lot of folks and you really want to get to the meat of it, asking them, well, why do you feel this way? Where is that coming from? Of course, I am disarmingly honest. That has always been a skill of mine that I think for a time I kind of weaponized when I was younger, because, well, if I could make people uncomfortable, then they were going to leave me alone. Right? And I know that I have been in and out of therapy for 20 years, but really working on it for the past 7-ish. I really understood where these are defense mechanisms. Also, you and I have talked about how really draining and exhausting it can be to be an empathic person. And this is also a word that I think is getting thrown around a lot more, which I don't have a problem with. You know, I've had students who have been raped and come to talk to me. I have students who have been victims of domestic violence and assault. I have had students who... I had a student who did a lot of LSD and I think was just in a state of such euphoria a week later that they came to me with a lot of philosophical and religious questions. And I was like, I don't have the answers, but we can talk. And I think logistically here's what's happening from my non-medical background, but as a person who's done some drugs, this is what I'm seeing. Don't worry about it. But being open and having those conversations and then afterwards being like, what the hell just happened?
Yeah.
And I think that those happen to a lot more of us than we realize. And we're just, where do you go with that? How do you decompress?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It is about being human and that the empathy. I mean, as you said, it's kind of a wave of empathy, but we should all, hope to have some kind of empathy. So that's a good thing. But holding space, yes, and being as open and in some sense vulnerable. I've talked about vulnerability in these conversations with folks on the podcast before and how important that is. And I'm sure everyone knows about Brené Brown and her conversations about vulnerability, which are fantastic. But I think too, as I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about this experience, and you and I talk about this a lot, also with our colleagues and holding space for them as well when they're in that state of being completely depleted after maybe just a semester filled with who knows what. And in the last several months, there's a lot of emotional taxing, let's say, on everyone. But I think, too, there's this belief, and maybe this comes from... I don't know if it comes from our upbringing. I don't know if it comes from a religious background, but it's this idea that you can kind of become the savior, that it really can be all on you to take on, the sins of the world, and to carry that and to somehow make it better, that it's our responsibility to do that. And I do think that is draining because there's a shift in perspective there that says, I am doing this out of my own power. Like I have to fill up my tank with something outside of myself, and I have to come at it with my energy. Ultimately, if we are in this mindful place, what we realize is that the energy source comes from a source within us that is infinite. It's not going to run out. Your tank doesn't run dry, but it is the things that you're doing in your life that can kind of drain you, or maybe misusing a little bit of that energy in a way that isn't self-regenerating, isn't self-sustaining. And I think that's kind of where we fall into these traps of feeling like we have to take everything on.
Yeah, and I, of course, do that. When you are in a space and you see someone hurting, I didn't come to this space of equanimity very easily. I stumble and fall all the time. This is how it looks for me. This is how I am able to maintain calm and composure and offer advice when it is solicited, whether folks want it or not. And I'm not saying I give the best advice. You and I both know we see so many people who are hurting, and it's inevitably they're just really hurting themselves. It's so self-imposed, and so much of that is the background. It is the childhood traumas that so many of us have experienced and internalized. It is the aggressions and the violence and the bullying, or in fact, the crimes that we have committed against ourselves or have been done against us. And again, we have so-called freedom of religion in this country, but we are based on Judeo-Christian principles. And we're going into as my yoga teachers will always remind us, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Mm-hmm. All of the old systems are breaking down and going to pasture. There are so many things that we have learned that we need to unlearn. And I think for many folks, it is first identifying what is not working, or what are the stories that you are telling yourself, or the stories that you were told that you need to unwrite, or just look at and say, that story don't work anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I gotta put that book down. I memorized that book. It's no good, right? There are so many things, so many fictions and mythologies that you can call whatever you want, that are still, folks still hang on to for a myriad of reasons. And I mentioned earlier the idea of fear. We are afraid of the other, right? This is Freud. This is basic. This is your existentialism 101 that you had to read in Dostoevsky or Camus' The Stranger when you were 16, right? It is the encounter with the other in which we perceive, or the Kafka and the metamorphosis, becoming the other. What are we so afraid of? What is so terrifying? And we have been taught by these systems, whether they are patriarchy or religions, that are telling us, because you are taught from a very young age, it's in certain spaces and in certain traditions, that this is the only way that it is. This is the only right way to do it. And everyone else is going to go to hell. Well, half the fun of going to hell is getting there, in my esteemed opinion. But also, what kind of a mindset is that? That is teaching you to hate, and that someone else is less than you because they have a different belief system. I think that when you really get to the basic structures that we are reliving today as a society. I got on my soapbox, as I tend to always do, and I'm doing this, and you're being very gracious, with my folks while they were visiting, and I was like, how are we just not reliving the Crusades over and over and over again as Western versus Eastern, or Christianity versus Islam? There were periods of time where everything coexisted and folks flourished. Why have we moved so far away from these things? And I know the answer to that. It's not a rhetorical question. So if someone wants to send me a Wikipedia link, I'm very capable of doing that myself.
Well, you have brought up a really important thing to consider. And as we witness people in such states of, as you said, pain and suffering, much of which is self-imposed, we kind of have to talk about what's going on in the world today, because we're heading into another, fall that is likely going to be as stressful, because there'll be lots of uncertainty, and we know how much we enjoy uncertainty. And I think everyone was ready for that to be over, and that doesn't look like it'll be over. I didn't really think that it would be over, but I recognized that everyone around me was very, very focused on the fact they were wanting it to be over, so they were going to will it into existence. And I think what you said was really powerful about these old systems have to fall. And the reason that we can be empathetic about just what that does to a person when your whole worldview or your whole mindset or your whole idea of stability has just disintegrated, right? So you find out your partner is cheating on you, your whole world falls apart, right? Because everything that you've constructed in your mind about your relationship, about your identity, it's just disappeared. It's just disintegrated before you. It can be, you find out you've got a diagnosis that you have to deal with, or maybe even just I've people who recognize they're going to have to eat differently in a major way. Like if you're diagnosed with diabetes, you're going to have to eat in a different way. It can cause a huge crisis, a personal crisis for a period of time before you sort of integrate what's happening to you and sort of acclimate and adapt. And I've seen that in you. I've seen over the years that I've known you at the college, there has been a sort of evolution of the way that your presence and the way that you handle yourself and the energy that you bring into the room. And it is lighter It's more, it's calmer. It kind of flows a little bit easier from when I first met you. And I was going to ask you, like, how have you, because this is why you can be empathetic when you see others, because you've gone through it yourself, because you've been at that place where everything fell apart. And that is, it's only then when you can start to rebuild something beautiful and something new. And that's what's happening to us on a collective level. But what that will trigger is all the individual crises are going to come to the forefront, and people are going to go through their dark nights of the soul. And we're holding space as much as possible. But it really comes down to how did you make that shift for yourself?
How long do we have?
Well, take what you need. Take what you need. I want to hear it.
Well, thank you for your observations, your kind observations. I understand that there's many things that I need to maintain a level of livelihood so that I feel like I'm thriving and not just surviving. And for a very long time, I was kind of coaxing on my mental health, I think is the best way to look at it. I would take my antidepressant, and then sometimes I would forget to take my antidepressant. I resisted labels. I resisted diagnoses. Why? Like, I don't know why I was so resistant to having a PTSD diagnosis or having a treatment-resistant depression diagnosis. I started taking my mental health a lot more seriously. I really worked with my doctor and my therapist and started really looking and digging into what the issues were that were causing me to shut down or be unavailable for certain things. And it's a lot of fucking hard work. It's a process. You got to trust the process. But folks, we are so, as a culture, and I think this is getting better, but it's nowhere near where it needs to be. Again, we got nothing but time, right? Until the end of days. And folks really need to get serious about their mental health, because we as a society push things under the rug. We pretend that things don't bother us. Or, as we are seeing and have seen, this inevitable fear that people have that they don't address, that manifests, and it becomes something much darker. Everyone is afraid of something. Everyone is fearful of something. But this hateful, not just the hateful rhetoric, but you can just watch the videos of these folks being very riled up and screaming and foaming at the mouth. There is something animalistic and monstrous about it. At times, I don't like to get into these absolutes of good and evil, but I think we are seeing folks' fear manifest itself into a space that is so dangerous that they have lost the ability to connect with other people, and to a point of delusion. I have been practicing yoga for 13 years, but I did not take it. I was very much into it for several years, and then I fell out of it. And I'd say in the past 3 years, I got back into it for the reasons that I was seeking. And I understand that a lot of folks use yoga as a form of exercise. I think that's great. Understanding very much where I have kept not just tension, but really hard experiences of fear and anger and grief, and just letting them be absorbed into my body. Mm-hmm. And there have been times over the past several years where I have gone to a yoga class with a particular instructor, and we have done things, and I have felt something that has been there for 20 years just go away. You just feel it leave your body. That has been the experience that I've had. We are so far removed from our bodies. And even folks who go to the gym, folks who are very active, I think we all are absorbing that grief and the trauma and the fear and the anger and not understanding what it's doing to us. It makes you sick. And going to that idea, as you said as well, of having to change your diet. I was rereading Thich Nhat Hanh's on anger recently, and he sums it up very, very easily. Like, what is this culture that we live in where you are overproducing food, and then when you're uncomfortable, you overeat the food so that then you can go to the gym that you pay for with the money that you earn to work off the food that you have overeaten because you were uncomfortable with the emotions that you were feeling. Mm. And this is how we operate as a society. We don't talk about we don't talk about the things that make us uncomfortable. It's impolite. Well, fuck that. We have to talk about the things that are making us uncomfortable and why they're making you uncomfortable. So that was my roundabout list of things that are keeping me sane. Oh, the beach, going outside, the sun. I learned very young, after living in long winters in the plains, that I have to have a sun lamp. Mm-hmm. I use that year round. That is something that is also helpful for me because I have a body that's just accustomed to shutting itself down. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. I have to change the way that I eat food, the foods that I eat. These are not easy things to do.
No, they're not, because it's breaking habits. It's breaking traditions, and it's breaking habits.
And I give myself gratitude or offer myself gratitude, I should say. It's sometimes difficult to accept, for breaking away from those things and acknowledging, this is a lot of hard work. And there are days where I very easily fall back into those patterns.
When you have those days, I have to stop you there and ask, because what I have noticed is the more that I put in play these kinds of behaviors that are radical shifts from the old habitual patterns, the more that if I fall back into it for a day, boy, don't I really feel the effects of what that has been doing all along. It is like so in my face. It makes it much easier to say, yeah, no, thank you, because I'm going to pay, and I'm going to pay hard.
It's like, there comes a point in everyone's life, for most folks, where you can't have a drink like you did when you were 21, right? So you go out at age 35 and you feel that hangover for a couple of days. The experience that you're referencing is, to me, very much like that hangover, where you're like, oh, I never want to do that again. I hate this. I had that recently with having a necessary conversation with someone, and we were kind of rehashing a lived trauma that we had both experienced. We needed to have that conversation. And so I knew that going into this, this is not going to be easy, but, we are friends and we can support each other through this. But the next day, I was a hot mess. I wasn't even hot. I was just a mess. I went to, I know the things that I need to do to navigate a day like that. So I went to bed early that night. I hydrated. I went to my 6:45 yoga class. But even in that class, I had to excuse myself a couple of times because I was just getting so emotional. But I knew that I needed to get that out of my body. Mm-hmm. And then I think I went to the gym later that day. And it was just a very exhausting day where I didn't feel like communicating with a lot of folks. Pretty much was quiet. Sometimes it's much easier to hold space for other people than it is yourself. Yeah. And especially because you worry, at least I do with an anxious mind, where I think, oh God, I'm gonna go over the ledge here. I'm gonna lose it all. Mm-hmm. But I have to remind myself that I have built a toolbox of all of these different skills or tools, practices, habits that alleviate that stress, that allow me to get to the other side. I'm very cautious of folks who don't want to feel their emotions, and folks who say, "Well, just I'm not gonna deal with that, and we'll just move past it." No, because it's going to.
It'll be there. It will be waiting.
Come up.
Yeah.
It's going to come up. So I allowed myself that day and didn't judge it, and then the next day was feeling much less sorrowful, much less weak, but then just mad as hell. And then I was like, okay, well, I'm just gonna be mad as hell today. And so I went and I went to one of my favorite spots. It's fairly secluded, very quiet. I just walked and walked and walked and walked. I walked until my feet hurt. And that was not a sadomasochistic kind of effort on my part. It's just I needed to get it out, and I got it out.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is that you have learned how to have your emotions in real time.
I go back to that idea of fear.
Mm-hmm.
I think so many folks that we know, so many folks that we don't, are so fearful of their emotions. Number one, because they don't understand them. And number two, what I know, I've heard from so many people, what happens if I open this up?
Yes.
I am afraid of not being able to stop it.
Yes.
Well, it's going to come out eventually.
It will.
And you can plug the dam, or what's the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike, right?
Yes, yeah, that story. Mm-hmm.
But the water is going to come eventually.
Yes.
And here we are, moving into another difficult period. But as creatures of habits, we need to understand how many of our habits are hurting us and hurting other people as well. And we need to be willing and able to break those habits and find other ways to create community, spark joy, heal, grieve, doing all of these things. And I don't think that we have to. I think that you can grieve and heal and have joy at the same time. I don't think that one has to take precedence over the other. And I also think that, going back to that idea of boxes, just because they're convenient. Well, we have the 5 stages of grief. None of those work in a chronological order. And grief, to me, when healing from grief, is never forgetting what you've lost or lamenting someone or something being lost, but also being able to recognize all of the joy and the sorrow at the same time. That, to me, is healing, and never losing sight of what it is from that experience or the individual that you have lost. We have this great word in Portuguese called saudade that does not translate very well to any other language, including English, and it is basically nostalgia, but it is a nostalgia and a missing and a longing for something or someone or something that you can't necessarily experience in the same way. And so a lot of folks will say, especially in diaspora communities, tenho saudade de casa, tenho saudade do meu país, tenho saudade de mãe. You can go back, you can always visit, but it's never going to be the same again. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have to get comfortable with, the cliche, be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah. And some things we're not going to go back to. We can't.
And why should we?
Right.
What was so great about the way the world was working pre-February 2020? What was so great about that world? And now we are seeing, for better or for worse, folks trying to normalize things, folks trying to go back to the way things were, and having pushback. So right now, obviously, we have the Delta variant, which is bringing back mask mandates. And some folks are reconsidering their office arrangements. Yeah, I read headlines, again, the 24-hour news cycle of folks, you got to get people back in the office. We got to have folks are more productive in the office. Says who? I understand the need in many situations and places to be able to have what you need to have to make things function. But I know a lot of people who are much happier working in a domestic space, who are much happier being disconnected from an unhealthy work environment. How many people weren't sexually harassed because they didn't go into a work environment? How many people weren't subjected to office bullying because they didn't have to go into a work environment? How many school shootings happened because we weren't in classrooms? 0. Right? And this is, at least for me, you know, this is a reality of where we work. This is something that a lot of folks who teach have to contend with. This possibility in our country. It is an ugly and, in my mind, unnecessary reality of working in a face-to-face classroom. But that don't happen in a virtual classroom.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, I don't know, sometimes, and again, not to be too much of a hippie, why aren't we just listening to what nature is telling us? How did we get COVID to begin with? How did these infringement upon wildlife, continuous urbanization of green spaces, tearing down those barriers, those natural barriers, because of urbanization, because of sprawl? We can't go back and undo it, but wouldn't it be great if we just kind of listened and said, oh, let's learn from that lesson?
That would be great. That would be great. Well, we're going to have an opportunity to see if we can do it in that way rather than resist it. And that's going to be our challenge. Robin, it has been great to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're getting ready to get on a plane this week and fly off and enjoy some vacation time that you so richly deserve.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun. I can't believe it went by so quickly.
I just really appreciate the work that you've done on yourself and the presence that you bring into the world, and, you know, the great friendship and support that you've offered me going through this time. And so thank you very much, Robin.
Thank you. Thank you for your support and your understanding and always just listening.
Robin's LGBTQ-focused radio show, Loud and Proud, currently streams on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. on Radio Massasoit. For more info, email Robin at robin.b.peery@gmail.com. That's ROBIN.B.Peery, Peery, @gmail.com. You have been listening to Interspace with Angelina Avedano. My heartfelt gratitude and appreciation goes to my husband, David Needs, Senior Production Engineer. If you would like to learn more about me or my work, look for me on Facebook and Instagram, Dr. A. Avedano with Cicada Personal Metamorphosis. That's Cicada with a Y, CYCADA. Or you can email me at dr.aavedano@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. This is Angelina reminding you that we're all connected.